At 1 in the morning on June 6, 1944, Germany was already receiving proof that the invasion had begun. Parachutes were opening over Normandy. Gliders were coming down in the fields. Telephone reports were arriving from villages that had never expected to become battlefields. And still, the tanks designed to crush the invasion did not move. Their crews stood beside cold engines and waited for permission. The officers above them waited for confirmation. The headquarters above those officers waited for a clearer picture. And at the top of the system, hundreds of miles away, the one authority no one wanted to disturb was asleep. By the time the German command finally understood what was happening, the English Channel no longer looked like water. It looked like steel. This is D-Day from the side that watched it arrive. Not as a clean story of a wall being smashed, but as a defense that discovered, hour by hour, that its concrete was stronger than its command system. Germany had built bunkers, mines, guns, obstacles, and armored reserves. What it had not built was a way to turn warning into action before the warning became irreversible. The failure began long before the first landing craft touched sand. For months, Germany's senior commanders had agreed on one thing: an Allied invasion was coming. They disagreed on almost everything else. Field Marshal Gerhard von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief in the West, wanted the armored reserve held inland. His logic came from a lifetime of continental warfare. Let the enemy land, let him expose his supply lines, let him commit himself to a narrow bridgehead, then gather the Panzer Divisions and strike as one mass. The theory was elegant. It preserved the armor for the decisive battle. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel believed that theory belonged to a war that no longer existed. In North Africa, Rommel had watched Allied aircraft turn roads into killing grounds. He understood what happened to tanks that had to travel in daylight beneath an enemy-owned sky. A Panzer Division 50 miles from the coast was not a reserve, he argued. It was a target waiting for a road. Rommel wanted the armor close to the beaches, concealed near the likely landing zones, ready to attack before Allied engineers cleared exits, before artillery came ashore, before supply dumps formed, before the beachhead became a system. He kept repeating the same brutal principle. The battle would be decided at the water's edge, and the first day would decide the battle. Both men were reasoning from experience. Both plans demanded control, speed, and commitment. Hitler created a structure that provided none of them. Some armored divisions were placed under Rommel. Others remained under higher command. The strongest central formations could not be released without authorization from the Supreme Headquarters, where Hitler's personal approval dominated the process. The result was not a compromise. It was a lock. Rommel did not possess enough armor to execute his coastal defense fully. Rundstedt did not possess the freedom to gather the reserve and launch the great counterstroke he imagined. Officers could request movement, recommend movement, and prepare movement. They could not simply move. Germany had placed more than 1,700 tanks and over 200 self-propelled guns in the West. On paper, that sounded formidable. In practice, only one armored division, the 21st Panzer, was close enough to strike the Normandy coast immediately. The rest existed behind distance, damaged railways, threatened roads, competing commands, and permission. Then came the weather. The invasion had originally been planned for June 5. A violent Atlantic system forced Eisenhower to postpone it. The channel rose. Wind and rain hit the Norman coast. German forecasters expected the bad weather to continue and believed a major amphibious assault was unlikely. That conclusion was reasonable. It was also fatal. The Allies had access to weather observations from farther into the Atlantic. Their forecasters saw a narrow break behind the storm, just enough time to launch the largest amphibious operation in history. German forecasters saw days of danger. Allied forecasters saw a window. On June 5, Rommel left France for his home in Germany. His wife's birthday was the next day. He carried a pair of shoes for her and intended to use the trip to speak with Hitler about the coastal defense. The officer who had argued that the first hours would decide everything was now hundreds of miles from the beaches, because the weather appeared to guarantee that those hours would not come. Across Normandy, other senior officers were also absent or attending exercises. Alert levels had eased. Coastal troops listened to the rain strike concrete and steel. Some wrote letters, some played cards, some slept. Off the English coast, nearly 7,000 vessels were already assembling for the assault. By the end of D-Day, roughly 156,000 Allied troops would have crossed by sea or air. The German sentries could not see them through the dark and weather. What they could hear, shortly after midnight, were aircraft. The first reports were fragments, parachutists near one village, gliders beyond another, gunfire in fields where no major landing zone should have existed. Telephone messages reached General Erich Marx, commander of the German Decisive Corps. Marx was an experienced officer who had lost a leg on the Eastern Front. Now he faced a map filling with marks that refused to form a pattern. Some of the confusion was real. Allied airborne formations had been scattered by cloud, navigation errors, and anti-aircraft fire. Men landed miles from their intended zones. Some of the confusion had been manufactured. As part of Operation Titanic, the Allies dropped about 500 dummy parachutists in several areas away from the principal landing zones. The crude figures carried devices that imitated the sound and flash of combat. Small special forces teams helped create the impression of troops gathering in the darkness. German units moved toward reports that seemed urgent and vanished when approached. The deception did not need to create a perfect lie. It only needed to make every report slightly less trustworthy. That was exactly what the German command system could not survive. For years, German intelligence had expected the decisive invasion at the Pas de Calais, where the channel was narrowest and the route into Germany seemed most direct. Allied deception reinforced that expectation with false radio traffic, double agents, dummy formations, and the imaginary threat of an army group supposedly waiting in southeast England. Normandy could be the invasion. It could also be the diversion designed to pull German armor away from the real invasion. Every new report carried both possibilities, so officers did what cautious officers do when the cost of being wrong is enormous. They waited for proof. The proof was already crossing the water. Before dawn, the first coastal observers began reporting ships, then more ships, then so many ships that the reports sounded exaggerated. Major Werner Pluskat, an artillery officer observing the sea near Omaha, looked through his rangefinder toward the horizon. The horizon had disappeared. There were landing ships, escorts, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, transports, and smaller craft packed into the gray water. The fleet extended beyond the field of view. It seemed less like a formation than a city that had moved offshore during the night. At 5:50 in the morning, the city opened fire. Naval shells crossed the coast in seconds. Concrete positions shook, earth lifted, telephone cables snapped. Observation posts lost contact with headquarters. Some guns were destroyed. Others survived but became isolated. This was the hidden weakness of the Atlantic Wall. It had never been one continuous wall. It was a chain of fortified points, stronger around ports and likely landing areas, thinner between them. Many coastal divisions were static formations with limited transport. Their men included older soldiers, troops recovering from wounds, and Eastern volunteers serving in German units. Some positions were formidable, others were unfinished. The wall could kill. It could not maneuver. Once bombardment cut communications and landing forces penetrated between strongpoints, each bunker became its own war. At Omaha Beach, the Germans possessed one advantage the Allied planners had underestimated. Elements of the experienced 352nd Infantry Division reinforced the sector. American troops approaching the beach entered a geography designed to trap them. The tide compressed landing craft against obstacles. The exits were narrow. Bluffs dominated the sand. Machine guns and mortars had registered fields of fire. In Weiterstandsness 62, Heinrich Severloh later described feeding belt after belt into an MG-42 as American infantry came through the surf. The weapon could fire more than 1,000 rounds a minute. It was built to make men stop, but the men below did not stop for long. The first waves were shattered. Officers were killed. Units landed in the wrong places. Equipment sank. Men crawled behind beach obstacles because there was nowhere else to go. Then survivors began moving in small groups. They did not wait for the plan to recover. They climbed where the defenses were weakest. Engineers opened gaps. Destroyers moved dangerously close to shore and fired directly into German positions. Infantrymen reached the bluffs in ones and twos, then in squads. From inside the bunkers, the scale of the attack became impossible to understand. A defender could fire until his barrel overheated and still see more landing craft approaching. He could destroy the men in front of him and discover that the sea had delivered another line behind them. The German positions inflicted terrible casualties. They delayed the Americans. They nearly turned parts of Omaha into disaster, but each strong point faced an enemy with more ships, more guns, more engineers, more radios, more medical support, and more men still coming. The Atlantic Wall was not being erased in one blow. It was being surrounded, isolated, and reduced one position at a time. Behind the coast, the armored crews were still waiting. Requests to release the Central Reserve moved upward through the chain of command. Officers at one level agreed with the request but lacked authority. The next level agreed and passed it higher. At the Supreme Headquarters, General Alfred Jodl and others remained uncertain whether Normandy was the main invasion. Waking Hitler with a false alarm carried its own danger inside the regime. Acting without permission carried another. so the system protected itself from making the wrong decision, and in doing so, it guaranteed a late one. By the time Hitler was fully briefed later that morning, Allied troops were already fighting inland. Even then, the belief that Normandy might be a feint did not disappear. The 15th Army remained in the Pas-de-Calais because the imaginary second invasion still seemed possible. That deception would continue to hold German forces away from Normandy long after the real beaches were obvious. The 21st Panzer Division was the exception. It was close. It had a prearranged role. It could still reach the coast, but even this division did not strike as one clean weapon. British airborne troops east of the Orne threatened its flank. Reports changed. Orders shifted. Units were divided between countering paratroopers and moving toward the beaches. Roads filled with military traffic, civilians, wrecked vehicles, and columns trying to move under Allied aircraft. Not until the afternoon did elements of the division attack north of Caen. For a moment, the German armor created the possibility Rommel had warned about. Tanks moved between the British and Canadian landing areas. Some reached the coast near Lion-sur-Mer. German soldiers could look out and see the same armada that had appeared that morning. But reaching the sea was not the same as breaking the beachhead. The armored thrust lacked the mass, coordination, and support required to roll the landings back. British tanks and artillery resisted. Airborne threats remained behind the German formation. Reports of new glider landings caused additional alarm. The panzer units withdrew from the coast. The only armored division positioned close enough to intervene had fought late, in pieces, against a beachhead that had been growing for hours. The larger reserve began moving only after the decisive window had narrowed. The 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr would enter the battle later. Other formations would follow across roads watched by Allied aircraft and through a transportation network already damaged by bombing and sabotage. They were powerful formations. They were no longer arriving for D-Day. They were arriving for the Battle of Normandy. That distinction mattered. On the morning of June 6, the Germans had needed to attack landing craft, exposed infantry, temporary exits, and incomplete supply lines. In the days that followed, they faced artillery networks, anti-tank guns, expanding airfields, naval support, reinforcements, and a logistics machine feeding the beachhead every hour. Every hour transformed the problem. At dawn, the Allies were an assault force balanced precariously between water and concrete. By nightfall, they held 5 separate lodgements on the French coast. They had not achieved every objective. Caen remained in German hands. Omaha had nearly collapsed. Airborne units were scattered. Casualties were severe. But the essential fact had changed. The Allies were ashore. The German commanders now attempted to solve with attrition what they had failed to solve with timing. For 7 weeks, German formations fought with remarkable tactical skill in the Norman bocage. Small battle groups used hedgerows, villages, anti-tank guns, and local counterattacks to slow larger Allied forces. British and Canadian troops paid heavily around Caen. American forces fought through fields divided by earthen banks that turned every lane into an ambush. The German army did not disappear after D-Day. It bled. Allied firepower forced panzer divisions to keep reinforcing threatened sectors instead of assembling for the decisive counterattack their doctrine demanded. Fuel and ammunition moved slowly. Replacement tanks arrived in numbers too small to cover losses. Trains were interrupted. Daylight movement became dangerous. The armor that had once been imagined as a fist became a collection of fingers plugging holes. Rommel and Rundstedt both came to understand that the campaign could not be won under those conditions. Their original argument no longer mattered. The beaches had become a front, and the front consumed every reserve sent into it. When Allied forces finally broke through near Saint-Lô in late July, Hitler responded with the same instinct that had shaped the defense from the beginning. Hold ground, forbid retreat, and demand a counterattack. The result was the Falaise pocket. German armies attempted to escape through a narrowing corridor under artillery fire and air attack. Roads filled with abandoned trucks, wrecked tanks, dead horses, shattered guns, and columns of exhausted men moving east. The system that had delayed movement on June 6 now delayed withdrawal in August. At the beaches, permission had come too late to strike. At Falaise, permission came too late to escape. By the end of the Normandy campaign, entire German formations had been destroyed or reduced to remnants. Tens of thousands of men were dead, wounded, missing, or captured. Most of the armored strength committed to the battle had been lost. The collapse was not caused by one sleeping man, one absent field marshal, one false weather forecast, or one delayed order. It was caused by the way those failures connected. The weather lowered alertness. Deception preserved doubt. Divided authority slowed decisions. Allied bombing made movement costly. The Atlantic Wall isolated its defenders. Air and naval power protected the growing beachhead, and Hitler's refusal to surrender control turned every uncertainty into delay. The men in the bunkers did fight, the officers did send warnings, the tank crews did prepare to move, but courage at the bottom could not repair paralysis at the top. Germany had built a wall of concrete along the coast and a wall of permissions behind it. The concrete held for hours, the permissions held longer. That was the real German catastrophe on D-Day. Not that no one saw the invasion coming. They saw it in parachutes, in telephone reports, in the ships covering the horizon, and in the naval shells falling around them. The catastrophe was that every warning entered a command machine designed to prevent the wrong move, and emerged only after the right move no longer mattered. The engines were ready, the orders were not. By the time Germany woke, the coast was already gone.